Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back from your break from the film Detroit, the fourth and final film in our 2021 African American History film series. I'll be your moderator today. My name is Dr. Karen Krieger. I'm a professor of family and geriatric medicine at the University of Louisville School of Medicine, director of health equity with the Health Sciences Center, and endowed chair in urban policy for the Foundation of Healthy Kentucky at the University of Louisville. This series is in its third year, and it's a collaborative venue between the Office of Diversity and Inclusion Health Sciences Center, University of Louisville, the Louisville Free Public Library, and Lean In. I'd like to thank our host, Paul Burns from the Louisville Free Public Library, for helping make this series happen each Sunday afternoon in February. Normally, we conduct this film series in the main branch of the Louisville Free Public Library, with panel discussions following a 2 p.m. airing of the film. This year, the panels are starting after the ending of the films per stream with a small break, still coordinating with the 2 p.m. Sunday streaming time. Our panel is starting at 4:30 and it will have a 5:30 ending time. Don't be shy about submitting your questions and comments on the Facebook chat or in the text support email line, which will be communicated to our panel. We'll answer as many as we can. As always, we value your opinions about our productions, so please complete the survey emailed to you after each film's events the day after the film. This week, our film is Detroit. It's a fact-based drama produced in 2017 at the 50th anniversary of the 1967 Detroit riots, when 3 rogue police officers sought retribution. After the film, you've seen, I'm going to start just a minute to introduce each panelist in turn. After they have been introduced, I will give them 5 to 10 minutes to give their impressions of the film. Before we start the introductions, I would like to have a short 3-minute film clip shared with you about the Algiers Motel tribunal that occurred after the trial for this documentary. Well, it's docudrama, right? So I'm going to ask our library host to cue up that movie, and I'll see you on the other side of it to give you our introductions. And it's queuing.
Well, I think my initial reaction was one of, shock and fear, and then also trying to figure out what I could do to be helpful to the family. Omar, who was Carl's stepfather, told me that 3 of the boys were killed, and they were killed by the police. And I then knew that I had to figure out a way to organize the community. Well, we decided the whole, it was we, when I say we, was Dorothy Dewberry, Lonnie Peake Jr., and myself. We decided to hold a tribunal because we did not believe that there was any other way to get justice. Detroit has a long history of police beating and murdering black people without any accountability, and we assumed that the same thing was going to happen this time. Well, we decided that the thing to do was to try to have the tribunal be as much like a court as possible, be as much like justice as possible. We had a judge, which was Justin Ravitz, who later became a judge for real. Ken Cochran participated. Milton Henry, the lawyer Milton Henry, participated. We then wanted to have a jury that people could respect. So we chose Justin as the judge because, in part because he was white, but also because we thought he was sympathetic. In terms of jury, we had Mrs. Rosa Parks on the jury because she was respected by the community. We then asked the writer John O. Killens, the novelist, to be on the jury. He was visiting Detroit. We then had Russell Brown on the jury. Russell Brown was a member of Central United Church of Christ, and I believe he was Republican, so we wanted to have someone who was Republican. Also, we had Frank Joyce and Valerie Shook. They were both white, and they were both members of a group here called People Against Racism. We knew them, and we knew them to be, fair people, and to be people who were not afraid of the police. We also then had Jackie Vaughn, and Jackie Vaughn was a state senator. He was part of the jury. And we had Ed Vaughn. Ed Vaughn was the owner of Vaughn's Bookstore. So we wanted to have open-minded people, and we wanted to hear the evidence and the facts. We provided a prosecuting attorney. We had defense attorneys for the police, and we wanted to have it as fair as possible, and we wanted to have a verdict based on the facts. Well, the verdict was guilty, first-degree murder, all charges. But we had no illusions that the officers would be convicted of murder, because officers had never been convicted of white officers murdering black people in Detroit. That had been going on for decades. And finally, they had the trials. They took the trial, I guess, to Mason, Michigan, and they were all acquitted, which we anticipated. There was no, we were not naive to think the white police were going to be killed for, were going to be held accountable for killing black teenagers. We weren't that naive. After seeing the evidence, we just could not, understand how the people, even in Mason, Michigan, could not look at that and be horrified the way we were. But that was not the case.
Thank you for that library support, Paul. We've seen movies before here. I think the one that's closest to a community doing another action and trying to form reconciliation was Best of Enemies. I'm going to start introducing our panel. Our first panelist is Professor Cedric Merlin Powell. He received his BA with honors in politics from Oberlin in '84, his JD in '87 from New York University School of Law, where he served as managing editor of the New York University Review of Law and Social Change. His prior work experiences include a judicial clerkship with the Honorable Julia Clark Mack of the DC Court of Appeals from 1987 to '88, a one-year term at the Carpathian Fellow as the National Office of the American Civil Liberties Union in New York from '88 to '89, and a litigation associate with the New York Law Office of Shade and Art, Slate, Meagher, and Frome from '89 to '93. He's a member of the Ohio and New York state bars and is admitted to practice before the Supreme Court of the United States and the federal courts of the 2nd and 6th districts and the Southern and Eastern districts of New York. Professor Powell has written over a broad range of topics, including affirmative action, critical race theory, the First Amendment and hate speech, and the 14th Amendment and structural inequality. All of his scholarship critiques neutrality as a means of preserving structural inequality and advances theories of substantive equality which reject colorblindness and post-racism as normative principles and constitutional analysis. We welcome Professor Powell. Our second panelist to be introduced is Chandra Irving. She's the Executive Director of the Center for Peace and Spiritual Renewal at Spalding University. She holds a Master's of Divinity, so I'll be referring to her as Minister Irving, and she also has a Master's in Education. She leads Spalding University and supports the city of Louisville in developing and applying restorative and spiritual practices that promote racial equity, healing, justice, and peace in individual and community relations. She serves as a strategist, facilitator, and master consultant in polarity management, building relations between residents and police. Her work with the city of Charleston, South Carolina, in the wake of the 2015 Emmanuel AME church shooting, in which 9 members of that church's weekly Bible study class were killed at the church, has been documented by PBS. For over 20 years, Minister Irving has served as president of Irving, Goforth, and Irving LLC, helping individuals and organizations across the U.S. and abroad clarify their purpose, surmount chronic difficulties, resolve conflicts, and build meaningful relationships across diverse groups. As a Fielding Lewis Walker Fellow, her life and work frequently draws on the transformative and timeless wisdom of mystic theologian, prophet, and community builder Howard Thurman. She's an International Coach Federation certified life coach who has written and contributed to several books and articles related to peace, human relations, and leveraging polarities for greater good. Her most recent publication, coming out in spring of 2021, is a chapter in And Making a Difference by Leveraging Polarity, Paradox, or Dilemma, Volume 2, called Contributing to a Just and Equitable World. Why is it so hard? Our next panelist is Miss Jessie Holliday. She is the Community Engagement Advisor for the Chief of Public Safety in the Mayor's Office at the City of Louisville. Ms. Holliday oversees the Group Violence Intervention Initiative and the Synergy Project for the City of Louisville. She's a native Detroiter, the city, not the suburbs. For more than 15 years, she worked as a reporter at several newspapers, including USA Today and the Courier Journal, where her emphasis was on public safety and the criminal justice system. After she left journalism in 2013, she worked as a communications director for Jefferson County Attorney Michael Connell, senior policy advisor for the Kentucky Cabinet for Justice and Public Safety, and as a special advisor for the Louisville Metro Police Department. As stated before, she's now working in the office of Mayor Greg Fisher as project manager for the Synergy Project, which is part of Lead Into Louisville. The Synergy Project has been created to strengthen relationships between Louisville Metro Police and residents to increase collaboration grounded in trust and legitimacy. By bringing together people from all parts of our community, residents, academia, business, youth, faith-based organizations, law enforcement, and political leaders, the Synergy Project creates an opportunity for police and community to work together in a safe, open, and respectful environment to identify root causes of distrust and find actionable solutions to move us forward. Ms. Holliday also works with the Group Violence Intervention Initiative, and she's co-founder of the Opportunity Network, which works to address policy and practice reforms for reentry from incarceration. Our last panelist, and no means the least, is a board member of the ACLU of Kentucky. That's the American Civil Liberties Union of Kentucky. Mr. Congo Januna is the first generation American of Kenyan descent. He's an associate attorney with the law office of Hessig and Powell in Louisville, where he's a litigator representing personal injury clients. He received his undergraduate and JD degrees from the University of Kentucky. And immediately after graduation, he went to work at the Jefferson County Attorney's Office as a part-time prosecutor and a city attorney for Metro Louisville government. He's an active member of the Smart Justice Advocates Group that promotes and lobbies for reform in the criminal justice system. And that's our panel for today. So we'll start out in the order in which I introduced them, asking them for their impressions and the lens in which they see this movie from their particular occupations. We'll start with Professor Powell.
Thank you so much, Karen. It's a pleasure being here with you. And in my 5 to 10 minutes, I'm going to try and do 3 things. But with one proposition, I'm going to focus on how whiteness circulates through the law and in society on 3 levels. One, making connections between Harriet, which is the first film that we saw, and Detroit, which is effective in our discussion because they are 2 bookends, but united by common themes. 2, I'm going to talk about white women and how that resonates within this film and in terms of criminalizing Black bodies. And then 3, briefly, some discussion about the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments and how this trial really legitimizes the oppression and brutalization of the African-American men in this case. Really to emphasize that this is not anything new. It happened in 1967 and is happening in 2021. So first, the connection between Harriet and Detroit. Harriet, we recall, focused on slave patrols, and one unifying theme that I talked about when I talked about that case, that movie, was dehumanization, brutalization, and criminalization. You need all 3 of those together to explain how the African-American men in Detroit were treated, but that treatment emanates from another time, the slave patrols. And if you dehumanize someone, it's easy to brutalize them. If you criminalize their conduct, it is easy to rationalize the overtly disproportionate impact imposed upon Black men. So we see over and over again that systemic racism plays a predominant part in law enforcement. Now, going to white women, this happened in 1967, the same year that Loving versus Virginia was decided, probably around within months of each other. And so you have this notion of miscegenation, prohibited interracial marriages still circulating in society because, after all, this is 1967. But again, this is not new either. In 1931, you had the Scottsboro Boys case. A white woman makes a false allegation of rape, and these 9 boys were tried and convicted. All of them except the youngest was sentenced to death. Sheila Washington, who is unsung in the civil rights movement, just recently died at the age of 61, young age, but she fought to actually exonerate the Scottsboro Boys. And there's a story in today's New York Times about that. But what she did was went through the evidence and showed how this system was geared to oppress African-American men. They did not have a fair trial. And that's going to lead me back to what I'm going to say about Detroit in a few minutes. But you have 1967 where Detroit occurs. You have 1931, the Scottsboro Boys. You have 1955, Emmett Till, same type of scenario. Implicit allegation of mistreatment of white women, and Emmett Till is lynched. So you have these either explicit or implicit allegations of mistreatment of white women, and then the law is weaponized in order to brutalize, dehumanize, and criminalize African-American bodies. Most recently, you have the Central Park Five, the exonerated 5, same type of scenario. Implicit allegation, mistreatment of a white woman, and these boys are railroaded in a criminal justice system that is skewed towards their conviction, with nothing else as that consideration. We're not talking about the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments. And that leads me to my last point, the laws. You have the 4th Amendment, which says people should be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. And if you look at this movie, the 4th Amendment does not exist in any form. After they found out that there was no weapons, that there was no threat to the community, that no one posed any danger, they should have been let go. But in order to do that, the police officers had to admit that they were wrong, and they could not do this. So they manufactured evidence, planted evidence, constructed a story, targeted people who they wanted to be guilty, all predetermining guilt or innocence based upon the criminality of Blackness. So the 4th Amendment did not exist. The 5th Amendment, prohibition against self-incrimination, did not exist. And the 6th Amendment, assistance of counsel, effective assistance of counsel, did not exist. So you had a warped criminal justice system railroading these African-American men in terms of their deaths and rationalizing their deaths. And then scapegoating the only other African-American person, Melvin Dismas, who was a security guard, and he received less appropriate representation than the white police officers who slaughtered these people in the Algiers motel. And then finally, I think that the trial was hopelessly skewed. You only had 2 alternatives, either first-degree murder or an acquittal. And based in the context where we have a law set up that rationalizes the brutality of police conduct, the verdict was almost assured. They would be acquitted in this particular circumstance. We see some of the same rationalizing influences in our criminal justice system today. I look forward to discussing that further with my co-panelists and the people on the chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cedric. Cedric, as a veteran, has participated in the movie Harriet, and he also participated in our review of the Central Park Five. So getting us a timeline of how that has progressed over 100 years, 150 years. Here we are. Our second panelist to share the floor with us is Minister Irving from Spalding Center of Peace and Spiritual Renewal. Minister Irving. Oops. Minister, can you turn your... Thank you. Okay, now we can hear that beautiful voice.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks to all of you. It is good to be here with you today. I'm a child of the South and of the Jim Crow era. And so, and watching this movie, it took me back to a place where I have been. And at the same time that it took me back, it just also resonates with the present. And I felt a deep sorrow, pain, and anger in observing the film. But I'd like to talk to you a little bit about this and my experience with this in the context of the work that I do and in the context of my spiritual commitments and what I have discovered about human relations in the context of police and race relations. One of the things that I noted in this film that really caused me anger and pain was the fact that the youth in this film were stripped of all dignity and respect. And aside from that, they were the idea that they would be promised violence and that promised violence would be delayed made it even worse. It reminded me of when I was a child and I knew I had done something wrong, and my parents would say, you're gonna have to, get some consequences for what you did. Well, of course, in those situations, I had done something. In their situations, they had not. And yet they were being held accountable. And most certainly being held with emotional imprisonment, not only just physical, but emotional in that situation. Now, I think all of that happened as a result of when I really try to boil it down and think about it in the context of, okay, so I think of all of us being one humanity. And so how did we get to this place? I think we got there because of racial indoctrination and socialization that's happened over many years and centuries, where we've been led to believe that one group is superior to the other one is inferior, and that is in terms specifically Black and white relations. So we have this racist message that has been perpetuated over and over again. And at this point, the people who were the officers, and especially the officers, were indoctrinated into believing that they were better than, they had the authority to do what they were doing, not only because they had a badge, but because of their race. And I think that was perpetuated, and I think it always is and still is perpetuated because of this concept from Howard Thurman. He talks about how we have contact without fellowship. And when we are in touch with one another all the time, but when we're in touch with one another and we do not have fellowship, we have nothing to counter the audacious and egregious lie of white supremacy. And so that same lie causes us, from a standpoint of Black people, often to overfocus on the position of white people and their dominance in our society, which then renders us incapable of taking independent action that can be revitalizing and empowering and rewarding. Now, I know that there are exceptions to that, but very often I think we fall victim to that. And this, what I appreciated about the tribunal was it was a reflection of taking independent action to do something. Let us figure out what we can do in particular to make a difference. So at Spalding University, our mission has to do with, it starts out, we're a diverse community of learners meeting the needs of the time. That's what we're dedicated to do, meet the needs of the time. And then it goes on to talk about how we're grounded in spiritual values and with the emphasis on service and the promotion of peace and justice. And the Community for Peace and Spiritual Renewal, located at Spalding University, is focused on facilitating individual and collective journeys towards common ground. Earlier, you heard that we are likely to be informed by Howard Thurman, among others. And one of the things he has told us about this process of trying to build relationships, trying to find common ground, is that we need to take a look at how we approach it. Often what we do is we will begin with our focus on what are we going to do? What are our actions going to be? Because we know we have a problem. And that's legitimate, except for often we get stuck and we can't make it, we can't move as far as we would like to move. What he has suggested is that we need internal liberation in order to achieve social transformation. And our internal liberation comes when we can transcend those inner barriers that we have that keep us from moving forward. That transcendence comes when we go through the process of personal spiritual renewal. And that involves engaging in some deep questions, both as collectively and individually. Questions like, who am I really? What am I here for? To what am I ultimately committed? And to whom am I ultimately committed? What do my behaviors reflect? Those are difficult questions to answer unless we have taken some time for that personal reflection, both individually and collectively. It's about establishing internal readiness while we're also trying to execute the external remedies. When we try to do one without the other, we are not as successful as we would hope to be. I'd like to just close out my thoughts by saying that there are, in addition to those, a couple of other things that are important, and that is looking at competing values like our individual responsibility and our collective responsibility, our determination to hold one another accountable, and goodwill. Those are values that are intentional with one another. And our focus on our present realities and acting now as we want to be in the future. And so with that, we find that at the Community for Peace and Spiritual Renewal, that it's important to be able to do storytelling, truth-telling, and action planning. And that is the work that we do within the community. And that's the work that we did in Charleston, South Carolina, which I can share more about later if time permits. And that's the work we've been doing with our community here in Louisville.
Thank you so very much for that. We have included in the chat boxes a link to an article about your work in Emmanuel AME Church, which had the shootings in 2015. It was a 20-minute segment, so the time here sort of prohibited us from showing that piece. But for those that are interested in Minister Irving's work, it is a very good overview of the concepts that she's been alluding to. We're now going to Jesse Holliday, who represents the city of Louisville, who has had lots of hats on in this arena. And I'm going to ask her impressions of this film.
Sure, thank you.
She lived in Detroit.
I did, yeah. So I was actually going to start with that. I watched this film really as a native Detroiter, first and foremost, because that is an essential part of my identity and a major shaping of my life. My parents moved to Detroit from college in just months after this occurred. They'd graduated from college, and my mother was a social worker, and they were radical hippies, and decided that my dad played jazz trumpet. So Detroit was the place they wanted to be, despite the fact that most white people at that time were leaving Detroit. So that's why in my bio, I always say I'm from the city, not the suburbs, because that is a distinction that Detroiters understand, especially when you're a white person saying you're from Detroit. So I remember watching this movie when it first came out and just thinking about how this shaped the Detroit that I grew up in, and the fact that I, in my life, consider myself privileged to have lived in the minority race. I grew up in a predominantly Black community and predominantly Black schools. And so that obviously shaped who I was. You know, I mean, I clearly knew I was white, and I clearly knew there was privilege to that. But I didn't really understand what that privilege and what that meant until I left Detroit to go to college and then move around the country. But it is also essentially how I look at safety, how I navigated to the criminal justice field, both as a reporter, always kind of migrating towards public safety and criminal justice issues as I wrote. That was my way of contributing to shed light on things that were not occurring in communities where I lived in a just manner. But then at some point, I decided I needed to move inside the system to see what change could be achieved in that role. And so when I watched the movie again, I watched it through the lens of having sat in the Emergency Operations Center almost every day since the civil unrest began here in Louisville, from going to the protest with officers who were community engagement officers, trying to be present, to listen in very difficult circumstances, and in the work that Chandra and I have done together over the past 2 years in trying to build trust and legitimacy in the community between police and residents, knowing as I watched the film again, you know, this is what every officer bears on their shoulders, is this history, and the role that they play in that history. Some denounce that history and some don't. And, you know, it becomes personal when you know good officers who are trying to do the right thing and who are just in their behavior, and you know that they're operating within a system that is set up to create these kinds of conflicts, right? Where you know that officers are not going to be convicted unless it's egregious. Even when it's egregious, I mean, when it's, you know, there's very rarely an opportunity, a chance when a time when there is a conviction, and that is the way that the system is built. So how do you get justice in an unjust system? And those are the questions we've been asking ourselves in this community for the past year, and much longer, but specifically this past year quite intensely. And so I think it's something we just have to keep leaning into. It's something that we have to be honest about. We have to build a true path to reconciliation, which starts with truth telling. And as Chandra said, the storytelling piece is an important part of that, in that, you know, we have to give people the opportunity to share their stories from their perspectives. And I think one of the most powerful things about the Synergy Project is when residents and police officers sit down at a common small table where they may have felt very far apart at the beginning of that conversation, they find they're a lot closer than they think they are in terms of what they desire for the community, understanding each other's perspective and the place that they come from in terms of protection. There's no way to say anything about what happened in Detroit at the Algiers Hotel other than that it was a travesty and an abuse of power. But that is not something we've come to terms with as a society, and we keep seeing it played out. And, you know, it is a cycle. When you think back on the references that that Mr. Powell made about how many times over history this is played out, you know, and so that can be discouraging also when you're in the throes of working on how do we advance if we feel like we just keep coming back to the same place. So I hope that what this discussion can lead us to, or this kind of viewing of these movies and these experiences, can help us see, do we really want to keep repeating? And is there something we can do this time in the way we approach our conversations and our work together and the development of the systemic change we want, that moves us forward, so that perhaps we don't end up back here again in another 20 years with more riots and destruction. And because, again, I'll come back to and close with, as a Detroiter, this changed the entire makeup of a city. It changed the entire economic reality for people who were living in Detroit. It changed the way people interacted with each other in some in positive ways and some in negative ways. This took place, you know, like 3 miles from where my neighborhood was growing up. So we need to learn the mistakes of the past so that we don't keep repeating them. And I fear that we are repeating.
Thank you, Ms. Holliday, for your perspective historically and bringing it recently to what's happening to our city. And then we come to Mr. Chagunga. You represent the ACLU, and the American Civil Liberties Union has been around a very long time. Please give us your perspectives.
Yes, first, thank you for having me. I'm kind of like Jesse. When I first saw this movie, actually back in 2017, when I saw it in the theaters, and I was with a friend of mine who, she was a white individual, and there were a lot of people who actually got up and walked out of the theater because they couldn't handle the brutality. I can remember people saying, oh, this would never happen today, or at least the police would be held accountable if it happened today. But what we know is that that's not true. And that's really the prism I watched this movie from, and to think about is the lack of police accountability. And it's one of the things that we've been trying to do at the ACLU is to pass legislation and or have a conversation around passing laws that hold police accountable. The reason this thing happened in 1967 to things that are recent in the city is officers are never held accountable, whether criminally or civilly. So why change? Why change? There isn't anything that makes officers want to act differently when they know they have this much power and there isn't anything that can be done. One of the things that the video that we saw of the tribunal, it was great to have that, and those are good for healings for the community. But I think that's something that we're talking about here is, what if that had been a civilian review board? Things that we're doing here in Louisville that has some authority or power to make internal changes. That would have been great to have there to make sure that we don't have a Breonna Taylor here in Louisville, Kentucky some years ago. So I think we have to really rethink policing, just completely reimagine the role of police in our society. I think we call on them to fix the ills of society, And that's just not fair. It's just not fair at all. And they, quite frankly, aren't trained for that. Oddly, as you pointed out, I did some work for Metro government. And part of that time was actually spent representing Louisville Metro Police Department and police officers. I've represented officers against claims of excessive force when I worked there. And I know things like qualified immunity really protect officers. And in my private practice, I now find myself suing Metro Louisville and the LMPD for those claims. So I've kind of seen it from both sides. I've represented some great officers who do great jobs. And I've filed suits against officers that maybe shouldn't be officers. I think we have to change some of the laws that are on the books to make sure that police can be held accountable.
Thank you for that, that honest appraisal and your expertise on both sides of the street. We have questions coming in. I'm going to start with the first one here, and I encourage our audience to send their questions and comments into us. But we'll start with this one. The patron has written, I was troubled by this film's reinforcement of the one bad apple theory about police violence. Do those on the panel feel a similar way? Is it just one bad apple in the barrel, or are we talking about half the barrel?
I think fruit analogies are inappropriate when we analyze structures of oppression. I think you look at police departments as a structural thing, and so one bad apple really doesn't get it. I understand that there are good police officers and bad police officers, but how those good and bad police officers function within that system is what we should be analyzing. And so the structure is flawed, and that's why all of this conduct gets rationalized. You can even have a good police officer using disproportionate force, and there's a way to rationalize it. It is always the police officer felt threatened, the police officer felt his or her life was in danger, but they have the gun, they have the baton, they have all of these things that they can use, and we still say that their lives are threatened. So there needs to be a re-envisioning. I totally agree about re-envisioning policing and re-envisioning how police departments are structured as well.
I would like to ask Professor Powell, you did a great job in delineating the three forces that we had to have and the need for structure. We have amendments in place that should have protected people's rights, but it's not happening. So how do we, is that a structural restructuring too? How do we enforce our amendments?
Yes, so I'll just say this. When we talk about systemic racism, that's what we're talking about. There's been a shift. We used to say, well, these are bad individuals and they're racist and bigots, and so we're going to get Bull Connor out of there and all of our problems will be over with. But now I think the analysis is more nuanced, and it has been for the last 20 or 30 years, where we look at structures. So you can have all of the policies that you want to, but if those policies are not reinforced and actualized and advanced by the structure you have in place, there's going to be a disconnect. So you need policies, and you need a re-envisioning of the way that structures operate around those policies.
Does anyone else want to chime in on that question? The first one we have.
I was just going to say also that culture is a big part of that. I mean, you can have policies, but if there's a culture of behavior or a culture of how people operate, and I think that culture is hard to change, right? The DNA of how an agency operates or a structure operates is very difficult to change. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out that there has been progress in some ways in terms of, policing and moving away. The part of the problem, though, is that you have an overall system and culture. And so when that's starting to shift, as we have young officers or officers who want to do things differently, the culture has to shift within both the community and the police department to expect something different, to demand something different, to participate. And I think to Kungo's point is you know, we ask police to do a lot that we shouldn't be asking police to do. It was not their design. It was not their job. You know, we ask them to be social workers and go into situations that are very difficult. And only collectively as a community can we address that. I mean, only if we can all take some responsibility, I believe, can we actually get culture change.
Yeah, some communities are actually parceling out actions of the police officers and sending social workers or sending other professionals to the site with a police officer, but letting them take the lead because that's what they're trained for and the police officers aren't. You actually touched on the next question that came up in our chat box. Based on what's going on today, does the panel feel we've made any progress? And if we have, what progress would that be? And you have alluded to that, Jesse. Does anyone else want to chime into that question of progress?
I think we're slowly making progress. I think we're seeing that locally with what we saw here, banning no-knock warrants, getting a civilian review board. But we still have a long way to go to change some of those structural things that Professor Powell was talking about. And that's going to be really, I think, long and hard work to do.
Okay. I'm going to go into another question that's been sent to us, and it's fairly long. I hear a lot about the protesters are criminals and looters. However, I've not heard anyone trying to understand what leads up to these problems. If someone takes the knee, it's your right to disagree, and we should try to understand the underlying issue that lead up to this. My husband was a truck driver in South Central during the LA riots, which was precipitated by the murder of a young Black girl by a grocery store owner. And so it's not so much a question, but as a comment that she's making, and she's sharing her personal frame of reference with that comment. So what are we doing to try to understand the other side? You have synergy, where it really means people from all different backgrounds are sitting down and discussing. Minister Irving in Charleston, your program, I'm not sure that what it was called, but it was similar in that you had people sitting down of the different walks of life to avoid this happening again in Charleston, South Carolina. You had people trying to understand the faces of people. In the interview of the clip that I have included in the chat, there was a police officer who had no idea of how he was viewed by the white community. He thought of himself as a 32-year-old white police officer with 2 kids playing soccer or something with them. And he didn't understand until he sat down with them what they saw. He approached them in a uniform. So personally, I think we have gotten away from trying to engage people with different ideas in a civil manner. That's why this came about, to create the safe space so that people could be able to express their feelings safely and be listened to. That's a bit easier face-to-face than it is on this virtual platform, but I think we are making some progress. Does anyone want to talk about how that influences the work that you do?
I'll speak to that. In Charleston, the project was called the Illumination Project, and it was really designed to illumine insights from both sides, from the community's perspective and from the police's perspective, about what was going on in their life experiences, and then together to figure out how can we work towards positive change in the community. Now, the project that we've been working on, and I will say that project has been very, very successful. It was we started working on it in 2015, and there are still things that are being done as it relates to that particular project. It's considered to be ongoing. The project that we've been working on, Jesse and I, with others, have been working on in Louisville, the Synergy Project is modeled in many ways after the Illumination Project in Charleston. And there are a couple of things that are really important we've experienced. One is that we need to, and often we don't, we assume that we're working towards a common greater purpose. And we're not. You know, I may say, I'm coming to this, but I'm coming to it just because I am interested in my own issue being advanced, and no matter what side that may be on. So what we do at the beginning is to identify what we believe is a shared greater purpose, and we invite those who are interested in that greater purpose to come to the table. I'm one of those people, you know, I used to want everybody to be a part of and try to see how we could all get on the same page at the same time. It took me a long time to realize sometimes that's just not going to happen. And so we just have to, we have to invite those who are ready. Mm-hmm. And once we do that, we start to talk about, okay, so what have your experiences been? And that comes into storytelling. So people are sitting around there listening to each other's stories, and they get a deeper appreciation for the things that they share, the distinctions in their experiences. And they start to be freed up a little bit inside to feel more comfortable, and the fears start to dissipate some. So I see you as a human being. And then truth telling becomes a really important piece of this. You know, it can't be about just trying to make you feel good. So I'm going to sit here and say things that make you feel good. I've got to tell you the truth. And then out of that comes another component, and that is when you're hearing one another's stories and we believe one another to be telling the truth, there's an extension of grace, generally speaking, that won't be extended otherwise. And then the thing that also made that project successful, and the one that we're working on here as well, is there were actions. It wasn't just about sitting down, storytelling, feeling good. It wasn't just kumbaya. It's about what are we going to do to change those structures and systems.
Can I ask a question? And it's going to be directed to each of you, but some of you might feel a need to respond to it more than others. If a person today in Louisville feels that their rights have been violated, what should they do? Where should they go? What is the process going to look like? How is that process different today than it was a year ago before the city went through that upheaval? So I throw that hot potato out there for whoever wishes to pick it up.
Well, I can answer from a police department standpoint. And, there is a complaint process that you can go through. I'll first of all say that you can call 574-7144. That's the professional standards unit number. It's 574-7144 if you feel that you need to make a complaint against a police officer. And there's a process to file that complaint, and you could also do it online. That is in an evolutionary stage in terms of how it would be different than it was before. I mean, we just had a new chief take over the police department. So there are some things I think she and the staff are doing to work on making that process better. It takes far too long to investigate incidents that are, claims that are made against police officers. It's cumbersome. It's not always transparent. So a lot of work needs to happen on that front. And I believe that with the Hillard-Heinz report that just came out, which was an assessment of the police department, there were some recommendations within that report to improve that process. So just from a strictly operational LMPD process, there is a way to make complaints against police officers, and I think we will see continued changes in that process in the months to come if they take the recommendations of the Hillard-Heinz report to heart and work on them, as I know they've been instructed, but I'm not intimately involved in that process anymore.
So who is it that's going to be the watchdog to see about the implementation of the recommendations?
Well, I think, first of all, the community is watching in a way that they have not ever before, which I think is a good thing. I think the mayor's office is also watching. The chief of public safety is overseeing that. And I think we have the civilian review board that was just passed by Metro Council. And I was fortunate enough to sit on that work group to create that panel, has the ability to, once they're in the process of selecting an inspector general for the mayor's office to have as a sort of investigative arm, and then the civilian review board will be an appointed panel of people. And I think 300 or more people have submitted their names as interest in serving on that panel of 11, I believe. So once that's formed, they will also have the ability to request investigations and Kungo can explain the pattern and practice legal language probably a lot better than I can, but they will have the ability to start doing some different types of assessments on the systemic part of that work.
I was coming to Mr. Chikungo to ask him, how does the ACLU determine what cases that they're going to work on? And how is this going to affect your work there?
It's a case-by-case basis. Normally we look at cases that will have system-wide or systematic change and don't necessarily do, like, if someone believes they've been violated, have their rights violated, we necessarily take that case unless maybe it's going to have more of a broader impact. What people should do is what Jesse said. I mean, that system has been in place for a long time. Hopefully, obviously, the Civilian Review Board will be another avenue. People should go out and find legal counsel if they really believe that their rights have been violated, and pursue it and speak out about it.
There's a question that's just popped up here. What role do police unions play in police accountability and officers' ability to abuse power?
My answer to that would be they have been an inhibitor. Obviously, Jesse can talk about this. Part of the issues with police accountability, especially here in Kentucky and Louisville, is the FOP contract, the Police Officers' Bill of Rights, and those things have been a real inhibitor to passing legislation that calls for police accountability.
I have a question that I wanted to dovetail with that. We have a Supreme Court that has 3 new sitting judges there. I wanted to ask this question. How are the decisions of our Supreme Court influenced by the citizens of this country? And I'm going to throw that out to Professor Powell for that.
Okay. I'll just say...
You weren't going to get off.
I'll note my own bias on this. I'm noting my own bias on this because what I'm going to say is sort of my opinion. So I'm writing a book on this. It's called Post-Racial Constitutionalism in the Roberts Court. And I argue, and this is the answer to your question, that the Supreme Court actually constitutionalizes oppression. They rationalize it in a way that makes it seem acceptable, but what they're actually doing is making sure that oppression and subjugation stay in place. So, for example, there are a number of criminal law cases that talk about the Fourth Amendment on its surface, but they're not really talking about the Fourth Amendment. They're shifting power to police officers to do whatever they want to. Or the voting rights case where they said we don't need the Voting Rights Act anymore because we've made so much progress. Or affirmative action, or a case many years ago that was sort of referenced. It's called Milliken versus Bradley. It happens in Detroit, 1974. And I think Jesse was talking about this. She was talking about how the Detroit riots changed everything. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court comes in and rationalizes that by this case, Milliken versus Bradley. It says you can't have school desegregation unless you can prove constitutional violations in the suburbs. Well, there are no constitutional violations in the suburbs. And so now you have the city of Detroit totally segregated in terms of their schools because you can't bus between suburbs and the inner city because the discrimination is in the inner city. The decision goes not in the outer suburbs. So that's why you have this school district boundary line between people who live in the inner city of Detroit and in the suburbs. And so those are just a couple of examples. I think that the Supreme Court subtly is actively engaged in constitutionalizing the racism of American society over and over again. And we're not even paying attention to that. There are cases coming up, like a reverse discrimination case brought by Asian Americans saying that they're discriminated against. And that's really putting pressure on all people of color. So now we have groups fighting against each other about affirmative action. And the Supreme Court is going to use that as another occasion to say, we're post-racial society, no racist conscious remedies. We don't need affirmative action programs. They're almost there. So those are just a couple of examples. I think that the court actually legitimizes all the oppression in society.
And everybody's on that court for life.
Yeah.
And so.
And it's 6-3 all the time now.
Yeah. So you guys have been awesome today. You really have. What I would like to do at this point is to start our wrap up, but give you a last chance to say something if you didn't get that question, or if there's a burning issue that you want to communicate to the audience before we wrap up our 2021 series.
Well, it's been an honor and privilege to participate. These discussions are always thought-provoking and insightful. And I think, even though we're in difficult times, this has been great because it's made this discussion broader and more richer. I think the film series has become national now. We've had a number of different visitors from across the country. And I think that's going to be a good thing when we come back in person. So it's just been a privilege to participate, and thank you for allowing me to do so. Thank you.
Well, you're very welcome. My thank yous are coming up here to everybody because it's been a great season. This is our final production of the African American History Film Series 2021. And I would again like to thank our panel for their presence and the sharing of their expertise on the film. I'd also like to thank our patrons for another successful African American History Film Series. Remember, you can enjoy the panel discussions all year round on the Louisville Free Public Library's YouTube channel or at lfpl.org/film panel. You might check the library's free public film streaming service, Canopy, for other films that you might enjoy. You can find Canopy on the library's website, lfpl.org. And to access Canopy, you're going to need a library card and password, but the library staff can help you if you call them at 502-574-1611, 502-574-1611. I'd like to thank our hosts, the Louisville Free Public Library and Paul Burns, Director of Communications, for their continued support over these last 3 years as they bring free events and materials to the Louisville community and beyond with their ebooks and streaming services. So Louisville, be safe, stay well, help support our community to be the best it can be by honoring and respecting diversity in ideas and culture so everyone is at the table. Peace, and see you next year.